you all for coming to the JAGNES 2019 Spring Lecture. For those of you who don't know, this year we established a Townsend Center working group for our graduate student journal, JAGNES, which is the Journal of Graduate and University Studies, as a way to fund student initiatives such as professional development, and as a way to bring in scholars to present on pertinent issues and topics within the field of Near Eastern Studies. So far this year, we've been able to host a few workshops for grad students in the department, including one last semester which was focused on academic publishing, and one which we have scheduled for this semester which will focus on grant writing. We're also gearing up to publish our first issue, which will focus on, will feature papers presented in our graduate student conference, Hard Times, which took place last spring.
And just for those of you who don't know, JAGNES is the Journal of Associate Graduates in Near Eastern Studies, and it's actually the first reissue of the journal. It's been out of print for 10 years, so we're trying to bring it back after a decade's slumber. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Mohammad Rafi is currently a lecturer in the European Languages and Studies Department, as well as the Humanities Core program at UC Irvine. He graduated in 2016 from UC Irvine with a dissertation entitled, I'm going to butcher this, From Kulturweit to Garbazadegi, a genealogy of German ideological interaction with Iranian nationalism. His research is focused on transnational studies and intellectual history. Graduating with a degree in German and an emphasis in critical theory, Mohammad Rafi is also affiliated with both the Critical Theory Institute and the Samuel Jordan Center for Persian Studies and Culture at UC Irvine. In addition to his research, Dr. Rafi has cultivated effective and meaningful ways to engage undergraduate students at UCI in central debates in the humanities, particularly at a time when this humanistic field of knowledge is facing severe institutional obstacles. His work on Germany and Iran has been published with Telos in the United States and University of Strasbourg Press in Germany and France. Tonight he will present his paper titled The Importance of Being Aryan, Confronting Nazi Racial Law and the Determination of Iranian National Identity. So please join me in welcoming Mohammad Rafi.
All right, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Special thanks to the people who helped organize this. I appreciate it. Yes, I will start with a little brief introduction to my teaching, to my method, and to why I'm doing what I'm doing here, why I'm here asking for your time and your attention. Just to get this out of the way, there is no biological basis for differences in race. Yeah, that's I think we've come this far. But these days there are differences between cultures that are being utilized to draw distinctions between people, and I would make the argument that differences in biology are dangerous. We know this through history, but differences in culture are just as ideological as differences in biology. Yeah? This is a new phenomenon, partially in the 21st century, because we live in a time where technology reigns supreme, and a lot of these distinctions that are being drawn between peoples and cultures are new to us in the way they are being displayed. So I want to make sure that after I read this paper, we can connect this to contemporary debates as well, and contemporary issues of race and questions that are pertinent today. So I'd suggest I start with reading this paper, and then at the end we have time for debate and discussion and questions, so we have some basis. Yeah? All right. So this paper investigates the politics of the Aryan discourse that took place between Germany and Iran around World War II. To understand this Aryan fraternity, we have to look back at the first decades of the 20th century. During the First World War, Russia and Great Britain occupied much of Iran's territory to achieve their geopolitical goals. After many humiliating encounters with these nations, Iran turned towards Germany for support in its pursuit of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. while Germany sought out Iran as part of its long-term strategy to increase its global influence. This strategy involved establishing cultural missions, which included positioning Iranians and Germans as racially allied. The end of the Great War and the onset of the Weimar Republic allowed Germany to build its economic relationship with Iran and position itself as Iran's third most important trading partner. Once the Nazis took over, members of the Pahlavi monarchy in Iran began to embrace their ancient Aryan history with new enthusiasm. This seems to have been part of an effort to concretize Iran's national identity with the intent of creating a separation between Iranians and Arabs. The importance of being designated as Aryans by Germany is best underlined by the fact that in 1935, Persia, following a suggestion by Nazi officials, agreed to officially change its name to Iran to emphasize the Aryan origin of the country. The development of an Aryan fraternity between the Nazis and Iran has led many to assume that Iranians were considered de facto Aryans. However, the matter is much more complicated. The discourse between the Nazis and Iran was representative of the conflict between geopolitical strategy and the weight of ideology. Iranians saw their identity as Aryans as a matter of national pride because it separated them from the Arabs. The German Nazis, in contrast, understood Iranians' assertion that they were the original Aryans, Ur-Arya, to be a way of testing the limits of Nazi ideology and what it meant to be Aryan. The Nazis faced a delicate balancing act. They had to keep their strategic ally in the Middle East content while staying true to their racial ideology, which changed in accordance with their political needs. It is my contention that the Iranians' appeal to be formally categorized as Aryans was related to their desire to reposition themselves vis-à-vis the West, which indicates the ambiguity of Aryan belonging. Iran's tactical alliance with the Nazis, which briefly elevated Iran's geopolitical status, did not mean that Iran shared Nazi Germany's fascist ideology. The first part of this paper will give an overview of the history of the term Aryan as it pertains to the German-Iranian relationship. It will trace its evolution from an idea into a recognized scientific concept that separated Aryans from Semites. The second section will examine the Nazi struggle to define the term Aryan in order to appease some of their allies in the Middle East, including Iran. The Nazis' efforts to categorize Iranians as Aryans came only after Tehran lobbied Germany, which demonstrates that the term Aryan was not as pure and scientific as the Nazis suggested it was, but was rather driven by political ideology. The third part will discuss the special case of Jewish Iranians and efforts by representatives to manipulate diplomatic language to include them as Aryans, which led to the coining of the term Jew-Guten. Lastly, a conclusion will bring together the relevance of these newly discovered documents for the development of Iranian nationalism and its relationship to Nazi Germany. The first reference to the Aryan people is attributed to ancient King Darius the Great, who described himself as, quote, Darius the Great King, a Persian, the son of a Persian, an Aryan of Aryan lineage, end quote. It is crucial to note that although the ancient Persian term Arya, which was used for a designated ethnic group, is related to the modern political concept of Aryanism that emerged in the 18th century, it has to be held separate. It is the modern European coinage that I discuss in this paper. In 1786, the famed philologist Sir William Jones formulated a theory that posited Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and Persian as languages that had a common origin. Jones's theory was foundational for future inquiries into comparative linguistics and inspired other writers to find a common genealogy between Europe and a mysterious East that often promised self-discovery to Oriental scholars. The first references to biological differences between Aryans and other races were advanced in the 19th century. The German Orientalist and ethnologist Gottlieb Wilhelm Leitner, upon a visit to the region of Ladakh in India, was, quote, impressed by the natives' physical features and clear eyes. He became convinced that he had discovered the cradle of the Aryan race, end quote. Moreover, Christian Lassen, a student of Friedrich Schlegel, added to the growing theories in the field and began making a racial distinction between Aryans and other races. Lassen's references to the speech and physical type of the Aryans linked the Aryan Indians to the Caucasian race through their language and physical nature. Arthur Comte de Gobineau took up Lassen's observations and was responsible for the popularization of an Aryan master race, which he claimed had traveled from the East to Europe. It is widely accepted that de Gobineau was chiefly responsible for turning a linguistic theory into a racial model that insisted on the superiority of an Aryan race. Thus far, we can deduce from the genealogy and rise of the Aryan myth that various efforts were undertaken to establish a linguistic connection that would position the Persian language as part of an Indo-European group that included German, Greek, and Latin. As aptly pointed out by Iranian scholar Reza Zia Ebrahimi, quote, "For many authors, this confusion of language and race was the original sin of the Aryan myth," end quote. Having located the origins of the Aryan myth in the early 18th and 19th centuries, we now turn to the 20th century, in which the Aryan discourse evolved into a political ideology. Alfred Rosenberg, arguably the most influential racial ideologue of the Nazis, wrote his 1930 The Myth of the 20th Century as a sequel to the British Germanophile Houston S. Chamberlain's Foundation of the 19th Century. Rosenberg, as the head of the Foreign Affairs Office of the Nazi Party, proposed a racial hierarchy that placed the Germanic, Nordic, Aryan kind at the top. Ancient Persia is also mentioned in Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century as having declined due to intermarriage with lower races. Rosenberg used his racial theories as a means to gain economic and political control, exemplified by the fact that Rosenberg's Foreign Affairs Office was the only Nazi organization with a definite policy towards Iran, advocating total economic control over the region. To ensure continued economic influence, the Nazis had to maintain good relations with an Iran that had finally established political order through Reza Shah, the first Pahlavi monarch, who seized power in 1925. After years of turmoil and instability, Reza Shah mounted a campaign to create state bureaucracies while trying to forge a national identity for Iran based on ancient Iranian glory and the claim to be the original Aryans. This renewed national identity was based on a glorious pre-Islamic past, and it blamed Iran's backwardness on its past Islamic identity. This stance, combined with Iran's strong desire to be viewed as a global power, fueled Iranians' pride and nationalistic ambitions, making their identification as Aryans of vital importance. Yet, Iranians' desires to be viewed as distinct from Arabs and the country's attempt at establishing its national identity were put to the test through the expansion of the Nazis' racial laws, formalized by the Nuremberg laws, which made the proving of one's racial heritage a part of daily life in Germany. The significance of being classified as Aryan versus non-Aryan became consequential when the Nuremberg race laws were introduced in 1935 at the Nazis' annual party rally. German Nazis frequently used the term Aryan when dealing with Iran in order to strengthen the two countries' economic and political relationship. Although the term was already in use in those diplomatic circles, problems emerged in 1935 when the Nuremberg racial laws became public in the Middle East, leading to strong reactions amongst many of the countries. Egypt, Turkey, Iraq, and especially Iran were offended that their people were not officially recognized as Aryans in those Nuremberg racial laws. This omission posed an extraordinary problem for the Iranians who claimed to be the original Aryans. In response, numerous Iranians sought to obtain Germany's official recognition that they were Aryan. a note written on August 30th, 1935 by the German diplomat Vico von Bülow-Schwante and received on September 23rd, 1935 by the German Foreign Ministry, lays bare the Iranian efforts to be designated as Aryans. In the note, Bülow-Schwante explained that the legation secretary of the Iranian embassy, Mr. Kaviani, had reported requests from Iranian nationals looking for a certificate to validate their Aryan descent. This Aryan certificate was needed, according to Kaviani, because Iranian citizens in Germany were being treated as non-Aryans. Their designation as non-Aryans was keeping them from being hired, getting them fired from their current jobs, and preventing them from receiving unemployment compensation. Additionally, Kaviani reported that German women who had married Iranian men were targeted for having married non-Aryans. Secretary Kaviani argued that Iranians had long been regarded as Aryans in Germany. He pointed out that one of the reasons for the name change from Persia to Iran was to document that ancient Persia was indeed the cradle of Aryanism. Kaviani requested that the treatment of Iranian citizens and their Aryan ancestry be clarified in a speedy manner to resolve a number of cases that hinged on this classification. Bülow-Schwante reported back to the Foreign Ministry that he had reacted evasively to Kaviani's request and suggested a case-by-case ruling for these instances. His note concludes by asking Dr. Walter Groß, director of the Office of Racial Policy, for a general statement on this matter, noting that this was a highly delicate issue for the self-esteem of Iranians. A negative response, according to Bülow-Schwante, could lead to undesired repercussions for political and economic relations with Iran, and particularly with the Shah himself. This insightful note from the German diplomat indicates the importance of the Aryan classification for Iranians' national pride, while also showing awareness of its consequences for the economic and, more importantly, ideological relations between the two countries. As newspaper articles on the Nuremberg laws continued to be published in the Middle East, Iranian officials resumed their submission of inquiries to German diplomats on behalf of Iranians hoping to be declared Aryans because they were the direct ancestors of the Aryan people. Finally, another note dated July 18, 1936, entitled Iran and the Nuremberg Laws from the German embassy in Tehran was received by the German Foreign Ministry. This note, which unfortunately is incomplete, asks the Foreign Ministry about rumors which have been circulating about a German law which is to be published forbidding a marriage between Arabs, Egyptians, and Iranians with German nationals and citizens. The note uses strong language to underline that even though the press has not been mobilized by the Iranians, there has been a fierce verbalization stating that a law like the one rumored would be a humiliation to the Iranian people, which is proud of its Aryan descent, and will not let anyone contest this identity. This strong statement recorded by the German embassy in Tehran speaks volumes about Iranian self-identification as Aryans. Now, a most fascinating and instructive case in regards to the classification of Iranians as Aryans is the situation of Jewish Iranians. The insistence of Iranians on being grouped as Aryans raised the question of whether Jewish Iranians could be included in this categorization, while it also tested the limits of Nazi racial ideology. For the most part, it has been recorded that the majority of Iranian Jews in Germany were treated just like other Jewish people by various public authorities. In the same note from 1935 mentioned in the previous section, the German diplomat Bülow-Schwante stated in regards to the distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish Iranians that it was, quote, theoretically not possible, end quote, to trace the lineage of individuals descended from Jewish parents and grandparents. Yet he argued that because the families of Jewish Iranians or those of Jewish descent were usually well known in Iran, their identification should be possible. Therefore, it would suffice if two well-regarded people could attest to the non-Jewish ancestry of the Iranians in question. Due to the efforts of the Iranian embassy to combat the ongoing discrimination against Iranian Jews, the Ministry of Economics notified the German Foreign Ministry that it would be willing to advise the appropriate public authorities to treat foreign Jews like Aryan natives. These nascent efforts to deal with not only Iranians but also specifically Jewish Iranians was only the start of a long back and forth amongst various Nazi authorities that has only been partially documented. It was precisely this ambiguity, however, that allowed well-meaning diplomats in Germany and France to manipulate the situation in favor of Jewish Iranians. One example is the Iranian diplomat Abdul Hussein Sardari, who was in charge of Iranian consular affairs in Paris. He used creative diplomatic language to argue that Jewish Iranians were to be exempted from the Nazis' racial policies. In order to protect Jewish Iranians from persecution, he insisted that they were connected to the Aryan racial stock as opposed to being Semites. Sardari is credited with coining the term Jew-Guten to designate Iranian Jews who have Iranian blood yet are followers of the teachings of the prophet Moses. These claims by Sardari, in addition to consular inquiries, led to further examination of the question of how to categorize Jewish Iranians. Due to numerous inquiries into the classification of Iranian Jews, especially through Sardari, the Nazi regime was forced to make a statement on this issue. Before any statement could be made, numerous German research institutions investigated the question of Iranian Jews. Ahmad Mahrad, the foremost expert on German-Iranian relations, explains that the responses from the German research institutions varied. In 1942, the Weltdienst Institute in Munich was the first to respond to the inquiry. 4 days later, the Reichsinstitut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage in Frankfurt am Main answered that the question that had been raised was of, quote, utter importance, end quote. It also admitted to the difficulty posed by this question. Mahrad argues that the institute in Frankfurt was not as frivolous in the determination of its racial ideology as the competing research institutes. Its answer represented an attempt to be scientific. Nonetheless, the answers, unsurprisingly, culminated in requests for more funding for advanced research. In addition to the reactions from the designated racial institutes, an ideologically charged response to the question of how to classify Iranian Jews came from the head of the SS, Adolf Eichmann, in a letter to the Foreign Ministry dated December 8, 1942. Eichmann dismissed the portrayal of Iranian Jews as part of an Aryan racial stock as, quote, nothing else but the usual attempts of disguise and subterfuge, end quote. Eichmann excluded Iranians of the Jewish faith from being categorized as Aryans and thereby refused to grant them an exceptional position. Even though there was no evidence of Jewish heritage in Iranian Jews, Eichmann declared that their belief alone was sufficient to justify the persecution. It would only have been viable to grant Iranian Jews this special position, he reasoned, if Iran had never had a Jewish question or full-blooded Jews in general. Mahrad characterizes Eichmann's reasoning for excluding the Jewish Iranians as pseudo-historical. For Eichmann, the status of the Jews in Iran had always been a historical question that was contingent on the political situation. Eichmann elaborated this point by explaining that 17th century Iran was marked by restrictive actions taken against Jews. Examples of these restrictive actions included marking Jews with red scarves and imposing curfews on them. He credited the improvement of the situation of the Jews in Iran in the 19th century to an ongoing intervention by the Allianz Israelites and Russian Jewish finance capital. As the start of the Iranian constitutional revolution, which lasted from 1911 to 1921, coincided with Reza Shah's ascent to power, Eichmann argued that a legal equalization had occurred in Iran, allowing Iranian Jews to enter government offices. Because the designated Nazi research institutions in Berlin, Frankfurt, and Munich did not come to a conclusion, and Eichmann did not grant exceptions to Jewish Iranians, their situation remained as indefinite as the categorization of Aryan itself. As mentioned, Eichmann's denial of de facto or de jure recognition of Jewish Iranians as a racial minority was a refusal to grant them a special standing. Nevertheless, the Nazis had to spare the lives of Jewish Iranians living in Iran who enjoyed the protection of the Iranian state. This did not guarantee the survival of Jewish Iranians who lived outside of Iran in the German-occupied areas. In Berlin, the Nazis were moving towards a conclusion on the case of Jewish Iranians and their ancestry. A note from the Reichschancellery maintained that, quote, the Persian and Afghan Jews were racially different from the Eastern Jews, end quote. Yet, it also asserted that they were, quote, generally no different from Jews since they did not have a Caucasian touch of blood, end quote. The above-mentioned director of the Nazis' Office of Racial Policy, Dr. Walter Groß, gave a final verdict on the case of Iranian Jews. Dr. Groß concluded that there was no reason for a special treatment of Iranian or Afghan Jews when considering what measures to take in accordance with Nazi racial policy, because they were on an equal footing with other Jewish people. Despite this conclusion, a German diplomat named Friedrich Werner von der Schulenberg attempted to salvage the situation. The German Foreign Ministry contacted Schulenberg, who had concretized his expertise on Iran by serving as Germany's envoy in Iran from 1922 to 1931. It has been argued that Schulenberg, like Sardari, tried to outwit the Nazis in order to save lives. It is interesting to note that Schulenberg was later executed for his involvement in a failed attempt on Hitler's life on July 20th in 1944. Schulenberg's explanation and confirmation of Sardari's theory of the Juguten as an Islamic faction testifies to the refined skills of this diplomat. Schulenberg explained to his superiors that the Juguten were part of an Islamic sect that essentially followed the Islamic rules with only a few adaptations from the Mosaic religion. He made the important statement that because Iranians were not Semites by blood, imposing the German Jewish law on the Juguten would be unjustifiable. He then cleverly pointed out that the enemies could use discriminations against the Juguten as propaganda to hurt Germany. He suggested, therefore, that Germany refrain from applying the German Jewish laws to the Juguten, or at least postpone their enforcement. These correspondences amongst German and Iranian diplomats did not reach an ultimate conclusion on the question of Iranian Jews. They are historically and politically significant, however, for what they reveal about Iranian self-identification and the Nazis' ambiguity about the term Aryan. Now, the desire of Iranians to be viewed as Aryans is related to Iran's struggle with political autonomy and the expansion of Iranian nationalism. Reza Shah's reign enabled Iranian nationalists to embrace the idea of a racially superior group of people who shared a common Indo-European language. Reza Shah's takeover in 1925 established a constitutional monarchy that showed strong anti-democratic and anti-communist leanings. A significant aspect of this ideological campaign was its expansion of Iranian nationalism. To do so, the campaign disavowed the Islamic period in Iranian history while simultaneously maintaining strong contempt for Arabs. For example, in 1936, Reza Shah attempted to cleanse the Persian language of Arabic and Turkish words, which were to be replaced by, quote, new and pure Persian expressions, end quote. The link between anti-Arabism and Iranian nationalism cannot be underestimated, as confirmed by Zia Ibrahimi. These nationalistic currents continued with the second Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who called himself Aryamer, which can be translated as son of the Aryans, son as in S-U-N. Blaming Iranian backwardness on a past Islamic Arab self was combined with a strong desire to be included as a world power. Hence, the emphasis on Iran's glorious pre-Islamic past. The goal was not only liberation from colonial rule as in other countries, but also the restoration of Iran's former glory. While for Germany, the Jews served as the Semitic other, in Iranian nationalist Aryan discourse, the Arab or Islam played the role of the other. A prolific proponent of this ideology was the Iranian literary critic Mirza Agha Khan Kermani, whose work is marked by anti-Islam and anti-Arab stances. Kermani argued that to find Iran's authentic identity, one must look to pre-Islamic Iran. He contrasted the noble Aryan nation with the savage lizard eaters. It is widely argued that Kermani was the first to mention the term Aryan in modern Iranian writing. As an Iranian intellectual and secular nationalist, he had a wide sphere of influence. Iranians' sometimes despairing attempts to be classified as Aryans by the Nazis in order to validate their identity can be seen as a political move aimed at positioning themselves closer to a European identity than to what was perceived as an Arab identity. In the minds of the Iranian leadership, being part of a superior race that was closely tied to Nazi Germany would ensure a place under the sun and help to transform Iran from the victim of imperial ambitions to a global power player with super-regional aspirations. Too often, this strategic relationship of Iran with Nazi Germany is mentioned as proof of an inherently fascistic undertone in Iran's desire for autonomy from the West. Yet, it is crucial to contextualize Iran's dangerous alliance with the Nazis as a means of achieving its own liberation from the great game between England and Russia, which not only predicated the future of Weimar Germany, but also drove the development of Iranian nationalism through an insistence on an authentic identity. The German Nazis faced a fine balancing act. The desire to stay true to their Aryan ideology had to be measured against the need to keep a strategic ally content. The Nazis never fully clarified their position on whether Iranians belonged to the Aryan racial stock, but instead seemed to have made decisions with a case-by-case approach. The original documents from the archives of the German Foreign Ministry that have been used here are a testament to the variability of what it meant to be Aryan in Nazi Germany, and reveal the importance that Iranians attributed to being Aryan due to their troubled relationship with the West. Thank you for your attention.
We have some time for questions.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
I'm
Thank you.
interested in your interchangeable or your use of the term Iranian. You talk about a population that is at least half not Persian, and when you talk about the construction of Iranian nationalism, after beginning in 1925 with the ascension of the Shah to power, the nationalism that was created and the nationalist project that was created is very much predicated upon an idea of Persian nationalism and Persian superiority and linking, Persian ethnic identity to that of the Aryans, where there are a number of different ethnic groups in Iran who would link their ethnic heritage to different groups that existed at the same time. But you talk about them as though they're a monolith and then single out, Iranian Jews as being ethnically or racially different. When there is a case to be made that there are other ethnic groups within Iran who would not include themselves in this concept of sort of Aryanness, or not at the time, and that's not at all discussed. So I'm curious about
Well, it's a great question because it's a difficult question. You're right that there is more to Iranians than what I have described here. I can tell you about the reasons why I chose to take this approach. As you see, there's a lot going on here, right? And this is a complex topic in which I have to make certain decisions on what to explain a bit further and what to, contextualize for pragmatic reasons in order to, to be able to make a point in less than 30 minutes. But I don't disagree with the fact that, Iranian identity is much more complex than the desire to be designated as white.
That wasn't my point at all. I'm saying that you discussed Iranian identity and the relationship between Iranians and Nazi Germany as though all of them are Persians who aspired to that Aryanness or had that same relationship with Aryanness. And that's not true of all Iranians.
I thought I was rather specific in showing that the discourse was part of the political discourse that was happening between representatives of Iran, political figures, and representatives of Germany.
And
so
the political discourse is centered around this idea of Iranian nationalism that was created by Reza Shah in 1925 that erases the term Persian and the ethnic designation of Persian within Iranian identity and has everyone as Iranian. There's an all-encompassing term. But what that does is erase and squash the identities of many non-Persian groups, force a language on them that was previously not forced on them, but then also links this idea of Iranianness to, say, an Aryan heritage, which is really only true, or the case could be made that Persians, the Persian ethnic group or designation within Iran have a link to an Aryan past. But as an example, and I find myself constantly doing this, the Kurds would link though there's a 400-year gap in history, but they would link their origin to the Medes instead of the Aryans, and they would never say we are the descendants of Aryans. And Kurds make up at least 10% of Iran's population, as an example. 30% of Iran's population are ethnically Turk, the Azeri. Reza Shah himself is half Turk, and that's never discussed either. So this construction of an Aryan identity and linking Persian nationalism that is called Iranian nationalism and just enforces Iranian nationalism is specific to the Persian ethnic group, and that's not discussed. And so I'm curious if you're going to be incorporating this, or if that will just never.
I mean, look, it's partially valid what you're saying, but again, I'm not dismissing it as that is not important. I'm just trying to. Would it have satisfied if I put a few sentences that would sort of acknowledge that, perhaps? Sure. No, I can see where you're coming from, but I got to get back to my answer, as in I have to make some pragmatic choices as to what to discuss in more detail in order to bring my point across. So I acknowledge your point, and I don't think it's not valid, but it's for purely pragmatic reasons and not due to ignorance. Okay.
Not as an academic, but as a tourist there recently, I have two questions. How did the Germans, during this period of time, define Aryan? And my understanding as a tourist in Iran was that there were 2 or 3 migrations that came down from the north, way over, that came down into Iran and conquered the Medians, and then became the Persians. How is that Aryan defined? Because they're not coming from the same place. They're just coming from up north, right?
Yeah. So let me give this answer. In my research on Aryan identity, I have come across a lot of stories, and that's what they are, right? Of migration from one group of people from one place to the other, right? And the further I delved into this research, the more stories I read and found about this migration of the people going from one geographical place to the other geographical place. So I'm not sure if you're asking about a specific group in terms of their migration, but I'm not sure I'm not sure about the specific case you're addressing, if you know what.
Well, I just don't think they're coming from the same people at all. They're simply coming from up north, some peoples up north. So I'm curious if the Nazis were defining Aryanism in the same way that Iran had defined their Aryanism.
I see, okay. The Nazis cleverly adjusted their definition of what it means to be Aryan based on their political needs. That's sort of that's what I can say about that. But the Iranians also changed their own definition of what it meant to be Aryan, at least a specific group of politicians that were dealing with the Nazis at the time. So it's important for me to point out that this was a political match, that this was all based on how to position yourself politically favorably and use ideology for that. So in terms of seeing themselves as Aryans between the Nazis and the Iranians, no, they had different definitions. They were different kinds of Aryans, but there was an attempt to make them coherent and to have some sort of narrative that portrays the Iranians as the original Aryans, the Ur-Aryas of some sort. And then after a lot of travel and migration, we get to the German Nordic race, right? Which then is that. But your question is very valid, and I wish I had a more satisfying answer, perhaps. But there are many, many different stories I've read about that I could point towards, so to say.
The orange collar.
Sorry, may I ask you to clarify a point, which I think I may have misunderstood. Is it true that for a time being that Iranian Jews within Germany were protected because they were under some sort of diplomatic protection, while Iranian Jews outside of Germany were not?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then was that protection ever revoked, or it was not?
This was done all case by case. Yeah. So there was an attempt by these two diplomats to find an exemption for Jewish Iranians in order to save them, right? Whether it was in the German occupied areas or Germany itself. The only place where Jewish Iranians were fully safe was Iran. Yeah, that's where they enjoyed the protection of the state. In terms of how many Jewish Iranians were saved by Sardar and by Schulenburg, the numbers really vary. They're as low as under 100. They're as high as 3,000 people that were saved. It's almost impossible to sort of nail it down as to what number is accurate. Different sources speak of different numbers.
And may I ask, when you say save them and case-by-case basis, for you to perhaps illustrate a bit more what that would look like, would it be that a certain Iranian Jew living and working in Berlin might run afoul of the authorities, and then there would be a court proceeding to determine his or her Jewishness? Or
no, it would be rather simple in that they were given Iranian passports, which do not designate whether you are of Jewish heritage or not. So Iranian passport was very valuable at the time, and with an Iranian passport, they could travel as non-Jews, essentially, and as Iranians that had a higher status. So that's what it looked like, essentially. No court proceedings. It was sort of towards the end where the war was heating up. So it was basically getting a passport in order to be able to travel freely. Yeah.
Sure. So Sardari gave Iranian passports to many Iranian Jews to enable them to travel freely. But what about Iranian Jews earlier in the war who did not have access to those documents? Is there an example of, because you're saying that the Nazis themselves decided to deal with the question on a case-by-case basis, are there examples of any sort of official proceedings where the German government would be involved?
No.
Particular?
The most that I found in the archives in Berlin on the situation of Jewish Iranians is what I have exposed here in terms of the statements by a few high-ranking Nazi officials. basically dismissing the claim that you know, the Iranian Jews are part of the Jewguten, which was a coinage, which was a complete fabrication of a word in order to protect these people. But there is no evidence that in any of the main archives that I have looked and any other sources that I have that write about these topics that have more information than this. So this, you know.
So it seems, sure.
You can follow up, it's no problem.
I'll ask after someone else, if there's more time after that.
Questions?
I wanted to ask about the origins of the German or Nazi narrative. Back then, was it that they said, okay, or created like the Nordic Aryan race, and then like adjusted it and said, okay, there was, it comes back from the Aryan race, or did they, from the beginning, said, okay, the Nordic Aryan or the Iranian Aryans are ancestors? What was their narrative?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I...
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. It's comical when you look through these interactions between these people, because you know when you think of Aryans, it sounds very serious, right? It sounds like this established thing that, you know, these are Aryans, these are some sort of superiority is ascribed to these people for various reasons. But when you look at the documents and the back and forth, and you look at the history of the term Aryans, right, you see it's just an attempt by people to make distinctions between groups of people. And then as time progressed and the term Aryans gained cachet, it gained some sort of credibility, the Nazis very cleverly attuned and refined their definition, and they purposefully stayed away from giving a definitive application of what it means to be Aryan. So what it meant to be Aryan in Germany was to be non-Jewish, right? But also to be seen as Nordic, right? So it was interchangeable depending on what the circumstances were. So it was absolutely ambiguous, I would argue.
I just recently took a class on the spread of Islam, and we were talking about the Abbasid Empire, and part of that was talking about something called the Shu Movement in the 9th century, which was a kind of a Persian backlash against Arabs in the 9th century. And I'm wondering if some of the rhetoric, I mean, it was interesting, as you were saying, that in the 1920s,